Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining Suman and I and our guest speaker, Dawn Castagno-Dysart. We are super excited that you're here today. We're here to talk about engaging children in the conversation on race. So Dawn, we asked to be our guest speaker today. Before I get there, yes, Dawn is family. So if you notice, we have the same last name. She is my husband's cousin. She's more like a sister and a friend, just love her. But very accredited to be able to talk to us today about this topic, and we're grateful that she's joining us. So today you can expect some information on teaching tolerance, on some tools in order to have these conversations, these very important conversations. But before we kind of get there, I wanted to just kind of start with a little housekeeping. So we mentioned that we will be changing up the cadence here on our meetings starting in September. So right now they're on Tuesdays at noon Eastern. So that will continue through August with maybe one exception. We have a little surprise for you. However, all our sessions are typically recorded, but on August 25th, we will be having an unrecorded session. So if you want to come, just have some community and conversation. Know that that particular session will not be recorded. So there will not be a replay on that particular date. Coming in September, we will also have 2 per month. That will be unrecorded. I do want to also say, if you're not comfortable on camera because we are recording, please feel free to turn your video off. We are not going to be offended about that. But other than that, we would like to kind of get started. Dawn has lots of experience in education. I'll let her tell you a little bit more about herself, but she's very competent to talk about cultural competence. And with that, I will kick it off to Dawn here.
Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you for Tiffany and Suman for inviting me here today to talk about engaging children in discussions about race. I think it's really important, of course, with our climate today. I think it's important all the time, really, anyway. I am an educator. I was a teacher, an elementary teacher for many years. I did go back and get my PhD, so I have my doctorate. And I have been teaching in higher ed. I'm back in the high school setting now, but my research area is culturally sustaining pedagogy. And so that's my area of research. So I have the qualifications, really. I really enforce the research and the teaching of talking to children, and also implementing that pedagogy in my undergrads that I was teaching, and how to implement that, talking about race, that pedagogy with them in their classrooms. And so it's something that I'm very passionate about. It's something that I talk to my own kids about all the time. And I think that if we want equity in our schools, if we want equity in our society, that it has to start with talking with our kids about race. It has to start young. And so this is why I was really passionate, and I said to Tiffany, please let me come talk for you. So I'm hoping that I can give you some tools, some things to talk about with your kids that will work for you. It's one of the things that I think if you don't have the language, if you don't have the tools to use, it can be really difficult to talk about, because for many parents, they say, well, I don't know what to say. So I'm hoping I can give you those tools to use with your children to talk about.
So one of the things I was hoping, if Christina's son can come and introduce himself, because we have one young adult here, and it would be great to hear what his name is. And he had mentioned a little thing before he got on, before we started recording, and I'd love to just hear what he has to say and why he wanted to join us today.
Hello, my name is Alex. I'm her son, and I'm here today to learn more about racism.
Great. Alex, how old are you?
Good for you.
11.
11. Thank you so much for joining us and for being so open and interested in this conversation.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us, because the only way we're going to make change is through learning.
Yep.
Yeah, and you're welcome.
So do we want to start then, Dawn? One of the things that you mentioned that you wanted to talk about was teaching tolerance.
So one of the best resources that I find for both educators and for parents is teaching tolerance. And I don't want to take the credit for teaching tolerance because as a researcher, of course, I don't want to take something that's not mine. So what I'm going to talk about when I talk about teaching tolerance comes from, it's actually a website, and we do have it. I don't know when Tiffany is going to show but I have some resources, I believe they're provided in the chat. It comes from Teaching Tolerance, and Teaching Tolerance is a part of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And so you can find their website at tolerance.org, and they have quite a bit of different resources for parents and educators, and how to talk to your kids, or as an educator, your students, about race. There's webinars that you can attend, resources that you can use that help you understand what it means to talk equitably, what it means to talk about race. If you want to talk about specific instances that have happened in the past that are happening now, and not just race too, but gender, any of those topics that when we want to deal with equity. So I highly, highly, highly recommend getting on that that website and looking around. But when I'm talking about teaching tolerance, I do want to give them that resource is coming from there, because I have to give them credit. This is not something that I've come up with, but I think it's highly beneficial when talking with kids about race. And again, anything when it comes to gender identity, and that we think about tolerance and teaching tolerance. And so teaching tolerance has 4 what we call, or what they call, identity, standards, and domain. And so those 4 identity standards or standards or domain are identity, diversity, justice, and action. And so those 4 build on each other. So when you're working with your children, you want to start with identity. And that basically is your child understanding, and you can do this for yourself too, because I highly recommend when you're talking about race with your child, you need to look at yourself first. Take stock of yourself first. Ask yourself those hard questions first. What are your biases? How do you navigate race? And so when you're doing any of these things, I highly recommend looking at yourself first. What do you believe about race? Those kinds of things. So when we're thinking about the identity, you need to look at your identity, and your child needs to look at his, her, their identity also, and think about who they are. They need to identify their own self-awareness, their own family pride. Who are they? They have to understand who they are first. One of the things that I really like to do with identity is for them to do an identity map. So this is a concrete activity that you can use. They'll put their name in the center, and then from there, they write things about how they identify as themselves. Who are they as a person? And it's from there you can really talk about who are you, and then from there explore also how might some of those things then, when you get to diversity, as you move down, then how do some of those, can those lead to privilege and bias? It was interesting when I did this, when I went to the Teaching Tolerance actual conference, I wasn't thinking about myself as I did this. I put down, I did put white, I put woman, I put things like that. And then things I like to do, like running, because you are exploring your identity. But one of the things, one of my facilitators was a gay man, and he had put gay. I didn't put heterosexual. And so after he shared his, I thought, you know what? I didn't put heterosexual. I wasn't thinking about that. That's a privilege for me. I didn't even have to think about that as an identity, because it's part of the dominant culture. So to me, I didn't even think about that. So when your child is exploring their identity, those might be things as you move into thinking about diversity and justice, where are some of those privileges that your child then has? But thinking about the identity, then exploring with that identity map. Who is your child? What are those things that makes your child who they are? And give them a self of confidence with that too, because they need to know who they are and where they come from.
So Dawn, a quick question, if you don't mind me asking.
Yes.
What what is the youngest age that you think that exercise is appropriate for? Because I'm sitting here thinking about, I could do it with my 15 and my 10-year-old. I love this idea. I'm actually going to do it when we get off the phone with them. But I'm thinking about if I had a younger child, 4 or 5 years old, how can I ask the questions where I'm not bringing my bias into that exercise?
So you can do an identity map with even a kindergartner, but you're not, when talking about bias and things like that, you're not going to get as much into the bias conversation, but you can do an identity map with even a kindergarten age child.
Okay, so my prompt questions would be things like, what animals do you like? Or it's those sorts of things, right?
And you're going to have to, well, and in education, we have this term called scaffolding.
Okay.
Which is a way that we help teach kids, which means you're going to have to do what we call more scaffolding with that child. You're going to have to give them a little, you're going to have to prompt them some more. So think about things that you like. Think about who you are. You're not going to get more of those things. Like as an adult, when I do this, I'm thinking more of, oh, I'm white. Oh, I'm, you know, those types of things. Oh, here are the things I like to do. With your young kindergarten age kids, it's going to be more things like, oh, I like to play Fortnite. Oh, I like to, you know, those types of things. Yep. So, but as a young child, you're wanting to explore more of just who they are as a person. And the identity map is not going to be as extensive with your kindergarten.
Right. So you can use prompt questions like what things make you happy, what things you enjoy doing, things like that. Got it. Okay, perfect.
More of those prompt questions with your young children than you're going to need to use. That's why I'm saying more of the scaffolding is connected with your young children.
Excellent. Thank you.
And so once you have that sense of identity with your children, then you're going to want to move. This is the idea that you want children to express comfort, joy, and understanding in the idea that it's a diverse world, right? We understand that there's diversity out there. There's understanding and caring in human diversity. Because once they have this sense of identity in themselves, they have to have these human connections and this understanding in diversity. And have language to express that too. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too as we get into talking more about race, but that's the second standard. And then once they have this understanding that yes, there's diversity and they have this caring and understanding for diversity and language for that, then we get to justice. And you can kind of see as we're going that these are building. Then once we have justice there, they have to begin to recognize that there is unfairness in the world. And this sense of, wait, there is this sense of, you know, things are not necessarily equitable. And of course, now we're really seeing that in the world, right? With George Floyd and the protest and everything that's happening with that there is unfairness, and we have to give them language to express that unfairness. And even young children can, if you are beginning to talk to kids about diversity, can express that. I think about young kids, even as old as like 6, if you've taken them and you've expressed to them unfairness, they can understand that. They can go, if you've taken them to a protest, they can understand that, you know, or I'm safe here because I'm white, whereas a Black person is not safe because, you know, if we've talked to them about George Floyd, they're understanding why a Black person is not necessarily safe when they get pulled over, whereas a white person is. And if you've given them language, they understand that. So that's why it's so important that they're having this understanding, right, about their identity. I understand that I'm white, so I have privileges as a white person that a Black person does not have. So it's that unfairness and their understanding, you're giving them that language. Then once they understand that there's this unfairness, then it's action. Well, what am I going to do about this unfairness? And so they have to understand and give them empowerment to do something about that unfairness. And what does that look like? Does that mean going to a protest? Does that mean writing a letter to someone? Does that mean, you know, joining a campaign if they're a little bit older and are able to do that? So you have to be thinking about that. I think about my son was in 2nd grade when Trump became president, and Obama had stayed the DAPL pipeline. And my son was very invested in that. And Trump undid that, and it was allowed then to continue. And I said something to my son about it, and he broke down in tears. What are we going to do, Mom? What are we going to do? How are we going to help? And I said, what are you going to do? And I let him think through. Well, right now, all I can do is write this letter. Right now, you know, so because he couldn't go, we can't drive all the way to Standing Rock to protest right now in the middle of the week. But it's, what am I going to do at that point to do it? To protest this, but I see this injustice, so how am I going to respond? So to me, to be thinking about how are we going to get through this, or how am I going to, but again, those steps, and you can see how they build on each other. I have to understand who I am first. I then have to understand that there is diversity, and I have to have language to describe that. And again, as we talk about, you know, how do we give kids language? We'll talk about that next. Then recognizing that injustice, and there is injustice, and then how am I going to take action, and what does that action look like? And again, with that action piece, you can be that role model. How are you as a parent going to model that? And so when we're thinking about that too, one way you can do that is ask your kids questions. So when it comes to, for example, identity, have your kids think about, how do they themselves speak up against biased language? That's one of the easiest ways to do it. So that's with the identity piece themselves. How do they speak up against, if they hear someone say something that's biased, how do they speak up against it?
Dawn, can you share a little bit about the story that you shared with Suman and I last week about how you talked to your daughter about that, or what she, kind of her experience that she shared? I think that's a great example to demonstrate that for people.
Which example?
The one with the dolls.
With the dolls, yeah.
Oh, the dolls. Okay, sure. So, and that actually gets into action too. So, my daughter does speak up against biased language. And so my daughter has, if you've heard of the Creatable World dolls, which are gender non-binary dolls, and she has quite a few which are multiple skin tones. And some of her neighborhood friends came over and said to her, why do you have so many black dolls? And my daughter said, well, why do you have a problem with the black dolls? And they didn't have an answer for her. And so she basically told them that if they didn't want to play with the black dolls, they could go play with her white Barbies. And then the comment was made that they thought the outfit that was on her black doll would look better on the white doll. And so my daughter said, well, you need to think about what that means. You're basically saying that white skin is better than black skin, and that's not right. So my daughter will speak up and say what she believes about when it comes to racist statements about color of skin or really anything. And she'll say things to old men too if they say things in public. So she will, both of my kids will, but it's because we've had these conversations about that. So she is very much, when it comes to how does she speak up against biased language, she will do that. And then when we think about diversity, it's recognizing how do others interrupt biased language. And I think when we think about us as parents, you have to think to yourself, how are you doing that? Because part of the reason my kids will do that is because they've seen me do that. So you as a parent have to think about, are you willing to interrupt that biased language that you hear, or do your kids see you modeling that behavior? So when we think about diversity, that piece of that, that's something that you have to think about. And so then when we think about justice, do your children's classmates, do you yourself and your colleagues, do they understand the difference between intent and impact in the workplace or at school? So that's something when we think about justice, because, you know, people will say, well, I didn't intend for that to sound that way. Well, that's the way it sounded. So that's an education piece too. And then for action, how do you or your child, what do you do to interrupt that biased language in a timely manner? Again, when we think about that action piece, you know, like when we go back to Gwen's, you know, she was interrupting that, but she did it right away. She didn't come upstairs and say, Mom, I don't know what to say. What should I do? She knew right away, I have to say something because these kids need to know that this wasn't right. So when we think about those pieces, that's something that we have to think about. And so when we think again about like interrupting, we have to teach our children that they have to interrupt that biased language right away. One of the things though, when you think about teaching your children how to do that, the best way to teach them is to question. And I think I left that out in Gwen's story. I think she said first, why do you think that way? I think I left that out. I think I forgot that. Yeah, she said, why do you think that? And I think that's what she said the first time. Why do you think that? Because the questioning is really important. If you don't question first, people feel attacked. So that's one of the things that I've talked about quite a bit with my own kids, is that you have to question first or people feel attacked. So teaching kids to use those questions like, why did you say that? Why do you feel that way? And then educate with then saying, you know, oh, well, you know, something you could have said instead is this. Why don't you say this instead? You know, this is something, because sometimes there's biased language when we think about intent. Someone said, when we think about, you know, I heard someone say something like, oh, well, we need to circle the wagons, which is, of course, very inappropriate when we think about our indigenous people. And I said, well, what about rally around that child instead? So thinking about, you know, well, you know, questioning, why would you say that? And then well, how about saying this instead? Or questioning and then educating, like, well, why would you say that? Is that what you meant by this? Could you tell me more? So helping your children understand that questioning first and then educating helps somebody not feel like they're on the defense.
And I think that's a great way, you know, as I was listening to the story, I'd also forgotten that you had mentioned that beginning part of it, because the first question that came to my mind is, let's say it's the first time it's conscious to me now.
Right.
You know, and I do want to go to my parent, or I do want to go to someone and say, how am I going to do this? But by asking that why do you feel this way? Why did you say that? I think can happen almost immediately, right? And I think that's how that immediacy happens, is you're having a conversation. You're not confronting anybody. It's not threatening. You shouldn't be threatening. It should just be a conversation. I'm really curious, what made you say that? You know,
Right.
Why did you feel that way? Because that is the more normal conversation even children can have, and it's easy to have it that way. And I would also ask that adults use that language as well, right? So even if this is not, you're being pushed out of your comfort level, rather than getting defensive on, you know, what happened there, it's a simple, why do you feel that way? Talk to me more about that. I want to understand, right? Because then that's how the conversation happens, and that's what's important. You're not fighting against each other. You don't know yet what you're fighting about. You're just trying to have the conversation and educate both sides on it. So I think that's really important. And that was the big piece I missed as well in remembering and recalling that story.
That's why I said, I remembered that she said, why would you say that? And
right.
Then, because that's, again, something that I've taught my kids, and it's something that I teach, as I said, my undergrads, is you always question first, because you don't ever want your students to feel on the defensive either, or a parent. If a parent comes in and says something offensive, it's the same thing.
And it can also be that unintended, right? They might have meant no harm by it. It's just the word choice that they had.
Exactly. And that's why we always want to assume that the intent wasn't harmful. And so we always want to question first and then educate. And the same thing, it's the same thing when we talk with our children about race, right? Because our children are naturally curious. And so we don't want our children to ever feel like they can't come to us and ask us a question. So that's why we don't want them to feel like they're on the defensive either if they have a question for us. We want to say, well, why would you say that? What would make you say that? Can you tell me more about why you think that? Because if we immediately shut our children down when they have a question, they're not going to come back to us. And that's not what we want. So I think that those are really important things. Yeah.
Perfect.
Does anybody have any thoughts or questions? Christina, Alex, or Thomas, anything that you want to share or that's resonating with you, or questions before we move on? You good? All right. Awesome. You can also pop them in the chat too.
Yeah.
And so what was our next topic? I think we were going to talk about resources that were out there, and how do we have these conversations, and more on the toolkit that we can build for parents to provide for their children.
So as I said, teaching tolerance is one of the best resources I think to go to, because there are all kinds of resources on there to use. It's for educators and parents to use. And so you can find all this information that I was just talking about on there. And then I have all the books on there, which I'll talk about some of those as we go through, kind of talking about specifics about talking to kids about race too. And then I can talk about some of those books too as I talk through this. So I think I'll just maybe talk about, as we go through the ages a little bit, I think too, about talking to kids about race. So at first I said this too when I was talking about when you're thinking about, oh yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. It's in the chat too.
Yes. So again, when I was saying earlier too, you really, before you begin talking to your kids about race, is you have to think about yourself first. So who are you? What do you believe about race? And be thinking about, what do you know? What are your biases? And I think it's important for all of us to really understand that we all have biases. We always will. But we have to really be thinking about what are those, confronting those, and always be willing to learn. I think that's what's really important, because the learning never stops. I was just talking about this yesterday at a meeting that I was at, that we always, the learning will never stop for any of us. That includes adults. So we always have to be thinking about that. And I was just telling Tiffany and Suman before this that Dr. Shraki Holly says, don't let your first thought be your last. So you might have a biased thought enter your mind, but you have to catch yourself and say, oh, wait a second. That was a biased thought. How do I rectify that thought? And so as adults, we have to think about that. And I think we also have to teach our kids how to do that, to think about, wait a second, that wasn't a thought that I should have had. What did I mean by that? Why did I have that thought? And how am I going to change that thought? Does that mean I need to read more about that? Does that mean I need to talk to somebody about that? And I really believe that, we can educate ourselves through literature, through talking, but also by talking, having conversations. And I think that conversations are really important and that we learn a lot by doing that. So when we think about talking with our kids about race, I think it starts young. It starts when kids are very, very little. And so, as I said, even very young kids, people say, oh, young kids don't recognize that race exists. And that's not true. They absolutely do. And so when young kids, and I've seen parents do this before, you have a young, very young child, a 3-year-old who will say, oh, that person is brown. And the parent is like, shh, be quiet. Don't say anything about that. We don't want to do that. We want to recognize what the child has said. We want to say, yes, that person is brown, because otherwise you're making it a topic, one, that the child shouldn't be talking about. And we don't want race to be a topic that's not talked about, because the reality is, for many white people, it is a topic that white people don't want to talk about. And that shouldn't be the way it is. It's white people are scared to talk about race because it makes white people uneasy, and it shouldn't be that way. And so, if we think about white fragility, if you've read Robin DiAngelo's book, that's very true. There is this white fragility that white people don't want to talk about race, and it absolutely is not going to change if white people don't talk about it. And so we don't want to put that on young. If we're talking about a white child that says that child is brown, we don't want to put that on already on another generation. So we have to recognize that the child has said that. We want to say, yes, that child is brown. We want to recognize differences, because there are differences, and we don't want to perpetuate this idea of color blindness. We all have different experiences. White people have different experiences than Black people, than Hispanic people, than other cultures. So it's just the way that it is. It has to be recognized. And by not recognizing it, you're saying that there aren't different experiences. And so we want to make sure that we recognize that right away. So, beginning to talk about that with children and recognizing that, make sure that we're not starting that already young. The other thing that we have to start talking about when children are young is recognizing that if children start having some generalizations by saying, well, all Black people, such and such, we need to right away talk to children and say, well, why would you say that? And asking that question, well, why would you think that all Black people are X? And then make an example of, well, why would you think that all Black people are X? And then talk about why generalizations aren't true. So, because those generalizations then lead to stereotypes, and we don't want to start the road of stereotypes. So I think that that's really important to talk about with kids, and it's stereotypes too for any race, correct? I mean, we're talking about, they say, well, all Hispanic people are whatever, because this is what leads to stereotypes, and we don't want that to happen, because stereotypes lead to prejudice, and then we go down that rabbit hole, and we don't want that. And so with young children too, I feel like one of the best ways that we can get past some stereotypes, some of that, that talk, and also with educating young kids about race too, are through using children's books. And you can see on the screen here that Tiffany has shared, I have some books that I really think are important to share. Now, I read these to all kids. I read these to my undergraduate students, and they love them. So the top books where you see children's books, those are all picture books that deal with different issues. Like Solwi is about skin color. Solwi doesn't think that her skin is beautiful because it's very dark. So, for example, if you had the issue like with the little girls that my daughter did, that would have been a perfect book to read to those little girls. Although I would read it to anyone because I think everybody needs to be educated on that. The Undefeated is just one of the most powerful books I've ever read. I highly recommend it. I'm not going to go through all these because it's going to take up too much time. But
if I can chime in just a quick second, just to go with our conversation that we had earlier a few days ago, representation is really important too.
Yes.
Hair Love by Matthew Cherry. My daughter has very coily, curly, tight curled hair, and when we read this book, we actually thought it's a Disney mini movie that comes before some of the big movies. She just sat up straight and kept saying, "Oh my gosh, Mommy, her hair is just like mine. Look, that Daddy is struggling just like you do." And we laughed about it, but I actually teared up because she could resonate so much with that young girl. And the first time she sat there and was like, she saw herself on there. And so representation is just as important.
And that's one of the things that I really argue with teachers and with parents and with my undergrads who are future teachers, is that our students, our children, have to see themselves in the books that they read. So that's one of the things too, I think, when we're talking with our kids about race, is that you need to be very cognizant of the books that you're choosing to read to your children when you talk about race, making sure that the books are written by someone of that race, ethnicity, and culture so that they are authentic. Also, that the books themselves don't hold stereotypes, what can help is by making sure they are from that race, or written by an author of that race, ethnicity, or culture. That can help with that, because otherwise you can see that, sometimes we see stereotypes perpetuated in books when they are not. And that's why it's important to find books that do not contain those. That's why I did put The Proudest Blue, which is about a little girl wearing her hijab to school for the first time. I Am Not a Number is about the indigenous boarding schools, because again, this is about race. This is about authentically talking about all races with your children. So I think for me, really books are a great way because they're conversation starters. So when you read these books with your kids, you can stop and talk about what it means. Like The Name Jar, it's about a little girl who comes and allows other kids to pick an American name for her, but then she realizes how important her name is. And I think that's so important. And then I have some middle young adult books. And again, I think it's important that when we're developing empathy and we're talking about having an understanding about what it means to, as I said, I will never know as a white woman what it is to be a Black man or a Black young man in this country, but I can understand. I mean, when I read The Hate U Give, I was in tears. My kids were in tears. It really, my kids had read this book and we discussed it. Well, I read it, but aloud, but my son read it himself, but my daughter was too young to read it to herself. But then George Floyd happened, and it really gave my kids a background and a sense of what it was like to experience police brutality. My son has actually read most of those books, All American Boys. And so when George Floyd happened, they were very familiar with the inequality and inequity between what a young Black man experiences when it comes to police, and my son says what I will experience as a white young man. So we have to talk to kids have these conversations about this inequality. And as your children get older, you can have deeper conversations about what that looks like. So if you've had these conversations as they've come up, and you've maybe taken them to some of these rallies, like, as I said, you've had these conversations about, yeah, I'm safe here because I'm a white man or woman, but this person is not because they are a Black man or woman. And you're having these conversations as they, as they're growing up, then you can have these deeper conversations about racism and inequity with your children and what that looks like, and then helping them get to that action piece. Now, what are they going to do? How can they combat this? And I think some of that too comes from now as they've gotten older. Let's explore the past together, which is really where I am with my kids, because they're 10 and 12. And so now we're really looking at more of the systemic racism. So now you can start to have those conversations with kids about what does systemic racism look like? Where does it come from? And so some of those books that I had on there, like the Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, are great ways to explore some of that systemic racism with children, and to have those conversations with kids, because I think that's the next step then in exploring race with kids, because we know that it's not going to be solved unless we really truly go back to looking at systemic racism. And I think too, then the next step also is, I think, Alex, you mentioned you see it on the internet all the time. And I think that's where our conversations with our older kids also go, is where do you see it in the media? Because
basically, I saw it a lot on Twitter when the incident with George Floyd happened, and then there were like petitions and like ways to help, and then all this hashtag Black Lives Matter started.
Right. So those were ways to help. So ways you could be an activist.
Yeah, and like donate.
Yes.
Due to his death. Yeah. I want to talk about a video which I saw, but I think it wouldn't be appropriate to like talk about. It's also like really like abusive, so I'm scared like to do this like while it's recording, and I'm still a child, but like here goes nothing. So a white policeman has like stopped a black woman's car, and then he had a taser, and then he tased the woman on the stomach while she was pregnant.
So how did that make you feel?
Very sad, and I felt very bad for all the Black people treated like that in the United States.
So how do you think you could help?
Just like spread it around and get more people to notice it.
Yeah, that's one way, right? So if we can get more people to be active and to be
I mean, I also want to donate, but I can't donate because I'm very young to do that. I want to like help in every way I can.
So could you write letters to your Congress people?
I can.
Yeah.
But the problem is, in our country, we don't have racism.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't have racism in that scale. We have foreign companies, foreign employees, we have foreign people all around. And I have people from my colleagues, friends from Sri Lanka, from Australia, from Ethiopia, Nigeria, China, and they all have wonderful experiences here in our country. So we don't have that. Anything that they always tell me, oh my God, you're so friendly in your country to everyone. You don't see if someone Muslim or anything like that. I can walk at 2 in the morning from one part of the city to another. Nothing will happen to me. So we're really and low crime, everything. So yeah, he doesn't see it, but he sees it on the internet.
On the internet here.
Everything, yeah, everything starts from because kids are looking, and I also told him because kids can also be racist and bullies you have everywhere, even here. So he should be involved in the world, not only in his country.
Yeah, but sometimes I'm actually bullied for like being fat, and the problem with that is that I'm fat because I just have some problems with my health, but I'm fixing that now.
So when if this is something you could think about too, is how could you could stand up for yourself then too.
I've learned that.
Yeah, because that's kind of the same thing as racism, just in a different way. So hopefully maybe you can be an activist for Black Lives Matter too, from where you're from.
Yeah, I am.
Yeah,
I'm like helping, and I've like saw popular like Black actors like making a speech, and it is very meaningful.
so one thing I would recommend then is maybe you could repost things. Since you're not here in the United States, you could write letters here to people in the United States, and you might try to read some of those books that I recommended. You might be interested in those.
Yeah, since I don't like books with lots of text, I might look up the children's books. Which one is good enough?
You'll enjoy. They're all good, and they don't have a lot of text, so you might enjoy those.
Yeah, but I'm also trying to work my way through with books with lots of text as well.
Well, maybe you could read them with your mom.
Yeah, I also actually found out that a Black author, so a girl who just like published her first book, is like trying to get 10,000 sales on her book. I'm actually interested in trying to get that book, but I haven't asked my parents yet.
Oh, well, that's
I think
great.
you just did.
We always want to support Black authors, so authors of color. So there you go.
Yeah. I'm really interested in the book, so I want to try it.
Well, maybe you can share that and we can put it out there. See, then we could get everybody that watches this to buy that book.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I
another
can
one
find
for
the
you, Mom.
link. If I can find the link to the website.
Well, you could maybe share it in the chat.
Do you know the name?
I don't know.
You don't have it here. I'll send it to Tiffany.
Okay. And I did send your mom the name of a book too that she's working on for you too. Okay. It has good stuff like that too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think you can become an activist, Alex. I think that sounds good. I think you're on your way.
Yeah.
All the way from Croatia. I love it.
There you go.
Wait, is it possible that I find it now on your laptop, Mom?
Yeah, you can. Okay.
You let us know when you find it. There we go. So now we have a new activist with us. So I think that's a good example of, why we here especially need to talk to kids about race, because we have kids in other countries hearing about what's happening here and, wanting to get involved, and look where we are. So I think that's, another reason that we need to talk with our kids about race. And I think, again, as kids get older, seeing it in the media, as we see kids in other countries are seeing it in the media. That's why it's important that we teach our kids to analyze the media critically, talk with them about what they're seeing on the media, why it could be biased or not biased. and talking to them about the racism that they might be seeing, or and how they might be influenced by that, because we know different sources, different sources have different views on how they, that's what I'm going to say, about how they're producing the news and what viewpoint they're giving. So they might be seeing, and depending on what they're looking at, maybe seeing different views on race. So I think it's important that parents are monitoring that and talking to kids about what they're seeing on the media. I think that's really important. My son was sending me some things that he was seeing that was fairly racist. I shouldn't say fairly racist. It was racist. That on TikTok, he was saying, "Mom, look what I just saw on TikTok." And of course, he is very racially literate, so he knows that this. He's like, I can't even believe someone would put this on there. So I think it's really important that we're having those conversations with our kids and saying, this is not appropriate. This is what you're seeing. I think the other thing too, as parents, that we need to do is talk to our kids' teachers and say, what is it that you're seeing? What is it that you're teaching? What books are you using in the classroom? Those kinds of questions are really important for you when you're talking to your kids about race, because you want to know, what is being taught at your school, and what the teachers are doing, so that you can have those conversations too, with your teachers and with your kids when they come home. I think that's really important. For example, a book like Little House on the Prairie, many Indigenous people believe that all those books should be pulled from all schools, but they are taught and taught and taught at schools when we think about how the portrayal of the Indigenous race is. So I think it's important, again, that as parents, when we're talking to our kids about race, that we're saying, let's explore things together. Let's be on top of what's being taught at school. What are you being taught at school? Let's make sure that the media that we're looking at and what messages that we're seeing as they're getting older. And we do have to, even as we're talking to our young kids, what are they seeing? Because even our 7 and 8-year-old kids are seeing the news. So making sure what they're seeing, what they're hearing, and then asking questions too to our kids, even at young ages. What do you know? And there are some different, some people were very adamant about, my kid isn't going to see the George Floyd video, but it was all over the news. And if your kid is seeing the news, they saw the George Floyd video. So thinking about, how am I going to talk to my kids about that video and about the inequities that are there and the protests that are there. And that's something that, as we talk to our kids about race, again, when we think about that justice piece, there is inequity. And I think, again, and I don't know how far down this road we want to go this time, or if we're going to do it next time, when we think about privilege, that's again something then that we have to get into with our kids. Now, again, as a white woman, I have to have that conversation because my kids are white, and they have to understand that there is that privilege. Now, if I'm a person of color talking to my kids, that conversation, of course, looks different. So those are conversations, again, that we have with our kids. I can only speak as a white woman, how I talk to my kids about that when it comes to race. Because those conversations look different. So.
Thanks, Dawn.
Mm-hmm.
I think we want to be mindful of time too. We'll definitely would love to have you back on, Dawn, to talk more about privilege and to move the conversation a little bit further. But I think for right now, if you have any if you have some, maybe some last minute comments, just sort of wrap things up, I think that would be great. And then we'll let everyone know when we schedule another time with you when they can join us again.
Yeah, so I think, I know it's a lot of information in an hour. And so I think that it can be a lot to kind of take in. But again, I think if you're kind of struggling, like, where do I start? I think books are a great way to start. Get those picture books out, read them, use those as discussion starters with your kids. And again, I think one of the best things, the most authentic ways to talk to race with your kids is when it comes up. Because, you know, those are a lot of the times when it's like, again, when we think about the teaching, even the teaching tolerance stuff is, did you act when it happened? And that's when kids are the most like, you know, oh, wait a second, this just happened. Now let's talk about it. So I really think, you know, for me, when I've talked a lot about it with my kids is, oh my gosh, this just happened. Or we're reading this book and this came up, because I've very much taught my kids to read between the lines and to find the, you know, the racism in books, the, you know, inequalities in books where they'll see these things. And so having those conversations with kids, I think the best way is when it comes up, when it really happens, and then to teach them to be advocates and to be activists, because change is not going to happen if we don't talk to our kids and we don't teach them to take action.
So one little caveat I would add to that, I think it also depends on the lens in which you have it. You know, it's like when George Floyd happened, I had to take a few minutes, actually a couple of days before I had the conversation with my kids, because my kids are half Black. So, you know, that was a very difficult conversation, again, for me to have with them. Mm-hmm. But I do agree. I think they're going to see it, right? I mean, you listen to Alex, he saw things across the country, across the world on what happened here in this country. Social media is out there. It's a matter of definitely seeing it, but having a lens in which you're comfortable and giving that right conversation, right? I had to make sure that my kids still knew they were going to be as safe as I could possibly keep them safe in the color skin that they have.
Right. And I would agree with that completely, especially things that happen on a large scale like that. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was heartbreaking. This was like, horrifying. But I think when I was kind of saying when it happens, I was saying like that little conversation Gwen had with those friends.
Yes.
To me, that Understood. Was immediate, you know. But yes, and of course, again, you know, who you are and how it impacts you has to impact how those conversations. Mm-hmm. I would completely agree.
Yeah. Great. Anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think those really for me were the wrap up comments that I think it really just needs, if it's authentic, and using those picture books, I think are a great way to start if you know, kind of like, what do I do? And again, really knowing who you are.
Any questions from anyone before we just wrap up here? Everyone's good?
I found the link.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he'll send it to me because he found it on his computer, and he'll probably send it to me and I'll send it to you guys.
Perfect. Alex, do you know at least the title of the book?
I forgot, but
that's fine. That's fine. We'll wait for the link from your mom then. Thank you, Alex, for going and checking on that for us.
Yes, thanks. We'll make sure everyone gets it. Thank you.
All right, so this was great, Dawn. We absolutely appreciated the tips and the resources that you gave us. Are a great way to start these conversations with our kids. Alex, you were fantastic. Yeah. Thank you so much for being on here and for being open and honest and sharing how you feel with us. We expect to see some really good things come out of you with standing up and being confident and being an activist, sharing your thoughts and ideas. You're well on your way to some amazing success. And then until next week, unless there's anything else, I know that Tiffany touched upon some housekeeping things. So keep a lookout for that stuff. Keep a lookout for the replay. If anyone has questions during their replay, you're more than welcome to message us, and we can either work to answer it or we'll get Dawn to answer those questions. But thank you so much for this amazing conversation, very needed conversation. We will definitely have Dawn back on with us again in the near future to continue this conversation about engaging your children in the conversation around racism.
Yep, and I was going to say too, I guess one more thing before we go. This list that I provided is no way exhaustive. I just put a few. Diverse Bookfinder is another great place to go to find other books in addition to these. I just couldn't put every book that I possibly know of on this list, or it would have taken me days. So Diverse Bookfinder is another great place.
Excellent.
Great. Yeah, that's great. And I have, we have a poll up on LinkedIn. You can find any of us on LinkedIn as well. If you have any questions, you want to reach out directly, encourage you to vote on the poll for moving forward with the dates and times that we're planning to do. And then if anyone's interested in moderating one of these discussions or coming on to speak like Dawn is and being a guest speaker, we are absolutely grateful for that in advance. So we appreciate everyone being on, and thanks for your time. Thanks, Dawn and Alex and Thomas, Christina, Karen. We appreciate you all. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.